Hey everyone, welcome to this week's Azure Infrastructure Update. It is the 7th of March 2021, but really what this is the week of Ignite. So we just had kind of the March Ignite, and so my goal for this week is to actually cover all of the major infrastructure related announcements they made at Ignite. And there were a lot of them, so I think we're probably going to need this. So while I drink this, you should probably get some sort of caffeinated beverage. Okay, as always, there's a lot of work goes into creating these, so a like, subscribe, comment, and share is always appreciated. First, I did create a bunch of videos this week. So a lot of people have been requesting kind of AZ500 type content. And so I created this kind of Azure Security Center and Azure Sentinel overview video that's really just an overview video, but will also help with those kind of AZ500 prep type tasks. I then created a kind of on the fly, the renewal experience for your certifications, that new 1 year kind of renewal process and that online assessment. Well, I had 3 emails waiting for me. I think it was Wednesday. And so I quickly took one of them so I could tell you what the experience was. It's very, very low stress, so don't worry about those things, but I quickly kind of walked through it. And then I created a video on the new AzureAD temporary access pass, a way to do a strong authentication to really bootstrap setting up passwordless authentication. So I kind of go through what that is. Okay, so let's get to the announcements. So obviously there are so many, I cannot go into a lot of detail. What I would absolutely recommend is make sure you go and look at the book of news. So this book of news goes through all of the key kind of announcements they made at Ignite, and then it links to kind of blogs to get you more detail. And then from those blogs, it often goes and links to the documentation to give you even more detail. So I'm going to talk about kind of those key things, but definitely I would go and look at the book of news. The Ignite YouTube channel is now posting a lot of content from the Ignite, so you can go and get some great content there as well. So let's get going. So VMSS flexible orchestration mode is now in preview. So if we think about VMSS, ordinarily we have an image, we have a configuration, and it deploys instances from that image. So what flexible orchestration mode does, it really now acts as kind of a container. I create this empty set, and I can actually kind of show this quickly. So what we actually will do is in the portal, we'll go and now when we create this VMSS, if I just go and do VM scale sets, there we go. I can now pick the orchestration model. And what we'll see is now I get this orchestration mode and I can do flexible, as you can see here on this screen. Now, when I do flexible, what you'll notice is right now it's saying image, size, all these things. That goes away. Now I just pick a fault domain count. I'm not giving it an image, I'm not telling it a size or anything else. And the reason for that is today, this new flexible mode is really acting as a container that I then create VMs. And as I create the VM, instead of now picking like availability set or availability zone, I can now pick, hey, I want to deploy to that VMSS. If I actually jump back over here super quick, and we just go to VMs and I say add a virtual machine, if I pick the same resource group as that actual set I created and I pick the same region, under availability options, you'll see I actually now have that VM scale set preview option. And then I can actually pick, if I set these up, oh, I picked the wrong resource group. That's not the one I meant to pick. If I actually pick the right resource group, I would then be able to actually see the ones I've created, and I'm still picking. Oh, now the region's wrong. Keeps jumping me around. But there you can see there is that virtual machine scale set in kind of flexible mode. So it has to be the same resource group and the same region, and there it is. And so today this is kind of the V1. It's really, think of it like an availability set plus plus today. I can put things in it, I can have 1,000 instead of 200, and I can pick an availability zone for that. And I can pick the number of fault domains. But over time, this will grow and add additional functionality to it, giving me the ability to mix different types, still maybe have images, add those scaling capabilities. Today, really availability set plus plus, more contents, can pick zones, which I can't do with availability sets today, but it's just going to get better and better over time. On-demand capacity reservation. So today we have reserved instances. This lets me say, hey, I'm definitely going to use this amount of this type of SKU for 1 year or 3 years, but it doesn't guarantee that resource will actually be available. With a capacity reservation, I'm basically getting an SLA to say, hey, this many of this SKU will definitely be available for me. Obviously, I have to pay for that. But if I had a mission critical workload that maybe I shut them down for some maintenance, well, I'm guaranteed that capacity will still be there so I can start them up again. If I'm deploying some big project, I can make sure that capacity is available before I start the deployment. I'm not going to, hey, you've hit some region level problem. So basically it lets me reserve that capacity. And I can combine that with reserved instances to get lower prices for those. The new M optional D to have local temporary storage SV2 SKUs are now in preview. So these are kind of these big SKUs, but they're considered these medium memory. And here we can see using those Cascade Lake processors. We can see there were those diskless options, so no temporary storage. And then with the D, I do get that temporary storage, but we can see the sort of number of CPUs and the amount of memory we actually get for those. So those are now available to us actually in that preview. I've already talked about this in previous weeks. So the Azure Cloud Service, that original kind of Azure Service Manager way to host certain worker roles and those cloud services, it has now extended support. So now there's an ARM version of that that gives me the benefit of things like role-based access control and tagging and RBAC policy. We still really want to try and get off of that. We want to get to app service plans or AKS or something else. But if there's a reason I still need to use those Azure Cloud Services, then there is that kind of extended support version of it. Trusted Launch for VMs is now in preview. Now you've probably heard of Secure Boot for your machine. The idea that we kind of have that secure root trust chain where components kind of check the cert of the next part, lets it load, then the next part, etc. Uses the TPM in the machine. So now I can basically have trusted launch for VMs in Azure. It has to be a Gen 2 VM, so it has a UEFI, so it has a virtual TPM. But now I can essentially turn this on for those virtual machines and get that trusted launch experience. We have that secure boot chain, thinking about, hey, we're checking those cryptographic signatures, all the way along from the BIOS to the loader, to the kernel objects, to everything else. We know there's been no kind of rootkit or bootkit or kernel level malware injected into that kind of boot chain of our virtual machines. So that's going to be available for both Windows and Linux. But again, it has to be Gen 2 because we need the UEFI, we need that virtual TPM. Azure Spot Try and Restore for virtual machine scale sets. Remember, Azure Spot lets me say, hey, I want these VMs and I'm willing to maybe pay this amount of money. So Azure has spare capacity. I can pay less to use that spare capacity on the assumption I'm willing to have them maybe taken away from me if the price hits a certain level above which I'm willing to pay, or pay as you go kind of needs it. So with this new try and restore, if a spot is kind of taken away from me, well, it will actually try and get it back to get my VM scale set back up to that kind of count that I want and try and give it an extended lifetime. So that's actually now in preview. There were actually a whole bunch of spot improvements. For example, I can actually go and see, hey, what's the average spot price? things like what's the average chance of actually getting kicked out, what is it for neighboring regions, really helping me make the right decisions about how I'm going to use that kind of cheaper capacity. Azure Resource Mover, so this is now GA. So remember, that's the ability that I deploy things to a region. So with Azure Resource Mover, essentially what it's going to let me do is, if I just go over to it quickly, we can see that for certain types of resource, it will actually let me move them. So I can go to this service, and for those supported types of service, it will actually let me move them between various regions. AKS I'm putting on a slide of its own because it had so many new features announced. So the App Gateway Ingress Controller went GA. So remember, App Gateway is that layer 7 gateway component. And essentially now there's this add-on component in AKS, which makes it very easy to attach my App Gateway to. I can just use the regular App Gateway APIs, etc., to define all the various rules and just use those into my workloads running in my AKS cluster. Now there's two features kind of related to Azure AD integration. So there's just-in-time access rules and conditional access integration. So the just-in-time access rules is based around the idea that for AKS, I can do Azure AD managed integration. So I can essentially take those Kubernetes various permissions and actually assign them to Azure AD users and groups. So what I can do here is something like the just-in-time. I can use Azure AD Privileged Identity Management to add people to groups. So I could have a group, set that as maybe an admin permission to my AKS cluster, and now use PIM to elevate into that group to become a member, so I can now manage my AKS cluster only when I actually need it. Then the conditional access integration is there's now actually a component, a cloud app for my conditional access rule. So if we actually jump over and let's go and look at our Azure Active Directory. So firstly on that groups thing I was talking about, so to be able to do the JIT, then it has to be one of those kind of new cloud groups. So I've kind of got my cloud group role demo. And you'll notice I have this ability to do privileged access. So that would let me use it with PIM and add and remove users on demand. And then in terms of actually the Azure Kubernetes service, if I was to go to my security and I look at my conditional access rules, I could just create a new policy quickly and look at my cloud apps and select a certain application. With over here, I actually type Azure Kubernetes. Here we can see the Azure Kubernetes Service AAD server. So with that selected, I could now create various conditions. Maybe it's MFA, maybe it's a trusted device, something else that I would have to meet that to actually now go and use my Azure AD integration with AKS. Then, now we have Calico Windows support. So Calico is really that very, very powerful network policy engine that I can do micro segmentation at a pod level, controlling those communications using rules. Well, before it was really Linux. Now I can actually use that for Windows as well. That's for Kubernetes 1.20 and above. Planned maintenance windows. So basically now I'm going to be able to have this control over the window of time used for maintenance activities related to my AKS cluster. There's now an Azure policy for customer managed key use for those OS and data disks for my Kubernetes. So if you actually go to policy, select the Kubernetes category, and then just search for key, you'll see there's now an Azure policy to drive using that customer managed key requirement for my OS and data encryption. I can also now have a public IP per node. So ordinarily, I go through a load balancer. That adds a certain hop, a certain latency. There are certain workloads, and funny enough, gaming is the one they use in the example, where I don't want that hop. I don't want the load balancer. I want to talk directly to the node. So I can actually now assign a public IP directly to my nodes. And then CNI, actually dynamic IP allocation. So the way networking works today when I'm using that direct integration with a virtual network through the CNI is it just pre-allocates a whole bunch of IPs to each of the agent nodes. If I was to actually jump over super quickly, and if we was to just look at a virtual network, so if I'm over here, and I'll look at one of my virtual networks where I know I have stuff, the first thing you'll see is look at all these AKS agent pools consuming a massive amount of IP space. Well, that's because it pre-allocates them. It pre-allocates that based on the maximum number of pods I kind of say I'm going to support per node. And so I have to kind of pre-assign that whole IP space and use that up. So it's a massive amount of IP space just being consumed. And then I really lack flexibility to change it in the future. So this new dynamic IP allocation option, it doesn't do that anymore. It will just go and get the IP addresses as they're required. So it's going to be a lot more efficient. Plus, because it's grabbing them when they're required, I can actually add to the CIDR ranges used for the pods. So it gives me better expandability. Right now, if I was to actually decide, hey, I need to add a bunch more nodes and I've run out of CIDR space, that's a kind of painful thing to have to do. Okay, networking. I'd already talked about this. So if I had a basic IP today, if I wanted to change it to standard to get additional features, use it for standard load balancer, really I couldn't. I would lose the IP. But they added the ability to be able to convert to a standard IP and keep that IP address. The Azure Load Balancer IP backend pool is now GA. So ordinarily with a backend pool, I add NICs. So that NIC obviously has to then tie something like a virtual machine. With this new IP backend, I don't add NICs to the backend pool. I just give it an IP range. So I can pre-allocate a bunch of IPs, say, hey, this IP range, you are the backend pool. And then later on, I can just give those IPs to different resources. And then via the probe, it will say, well, that IP is there now, I'll start using it. So it gives me a bit more flexibility in terms of actually adding things to the backend pool. And now I could add things like a container directly. I couldn't do that before because the container doesn't have a NIC. Well, now it's an IP address. Well, pods can have IP addresses. I can now add things like a pod directly into a backend pool. So it gives me more flexibility. It has to be a standard load balancer. There were some restrictions, so go and check out the docs to get all of the detail on that. But it is now GA. There's no load balancer guided experience. It's actually pretty nice. There are a lot of load balancing solutions. I've got the Azure Load Balancer, I've got App Gateway, I've got Traffic Manager, I've got Azure Front Door. Which one do I use? So now they have this experience that I can essentially say, well, what should I do? So if I go up here, Load Balancer, help me choose. You see this option, help me choose. If I select that, it's going to do a few different things. One, just starts asking me questions. Hey, is it going to use HTTP? Oh, sure, yes. Okay, then you want one of these things. Notice it's removed Azure Load Balancer because that's layer 4, doesn't really understand layer 7, HTTP, HTTPS. Well, okay, is it internet facing? Yes, well, then all those things still apply. Is it multi-region? Okay, do you want performance acceleration? And then it just starts asking me questions to narrow it down to what is the right service for me. Additionally, I can go and click this service comparison tab to see all of the services, and it will show me different details about them. Hey, well, what can I run behind this thing? Okay, Azure, non-Azure, on-prem, or this one's Azure only for the load balancer. Session affinity, TLS offloading, does it support what type of security? So it really lets me just kind of go through and understand them. And again, when I go back to the help me choose, I can always go to more information about any of them to see articles, security, really just guiding me through that overall experience to help me pick the right load balancing option. Routing preference has gone GA. I've actually done a whole separate video on this. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but essentially this is the whole idea behind the idea that, well, you've got the Azure backbone network and you have resources kind of in a region, and then there's the network that you're connected on, maybe your ISP. And we think about there's lots of edge locations on the Azure network where it connects to other networks. Maybe it's connecting there and there, etc. So ordinarily with Azure, if I was kind of sitting over here connected to my ISP, it's cold potato. And what that means is when I make a request, it tries to get me onto the Azure network as quick as possible, my closest point, and it will keep the traffic on the Azure network as long as possible and egress at kind of the furthest point. So it keeps it on that Azure fantastic performant network. Hot potato is where, well, actually, I want to save some money. I want the cheaper option, and you save a few pennies. So now we'll actually keep it on kind of the ISP and only onboard it to the Azure network at the last moment. Likewise, Azure Hot Potato, pass it off as quick as possible. We'll kind of get it off of our backbone as quick as possible onto the internet. So you have that choice, and I can use that for public IPs and storage accounts. Storage accounts will give you two endpoints. One, kind of the Microsoft backbone, one, that kind of hot potato option. And again, I did a whole video on hot and cold potato with me holding a little potato. So if you were curious about a bit more detail, I have a dedicated video on that. But that's now GA. I talked about these 2 weeks ago. So the Azure Front Door and Firewall Premium previews are kind of there. So if you remember the whole big deal, this is kind of like this Azure Front Door V2. It's bringing together a lot of the good features around dynamic content with Front Door, static content with the CDN, and then the web application firewall to actually give me kind of protection for that. And then the Firewall Premium is now actually letting me do TLS inspection. It can crack open those encrypted packets because it's going to sit in between, have a trusted cert. It's going to do intrusion detection and prevention by actually looking for specific patterns, specific sequences in that network traffic. And whereas normally the firewall is just fully qualified domain names, well, with the premium, it will actually look at URLs, which is kind of also including kind of the path, the files. And obviously, because it can now crack open the packets with the TLS inspection, it can even look at that in encrypted traffic. So URL filtering and categories actually based on URL as well. Then we have the route server. Route server is all based around the idea that we have these IP spaces that today can be fairly painful to handle. Imagine a very, very simple scenario that, hey, I have a virtual network, I have some maybe on-premises location, and I have a network virtual appliance running in here. Well, I have to do a whole bunch of stuff around user-defined routes to say, hey, if you want to get to this IP space, and then you have to go to this address. If there was maybe a firewall appliance over here that connected to the internet, well, then there's other UDRs I had to say, hey, the default route, go over that way. So what route server does is it runs in its own little subnet. We deploy route server, and now virtual appliances can actually establish BGP sessions. So remember, BGP is all about exchanging knowledge of the IP space. So now these appliances can tell via route server to the VNet, hey, these are the IP spaces I have access to. So now the VNet knows about those, and resources on it will know those paths. I don't have to manually set UDRs anymore. Likewise, these appliances can learn about the IP space of the VNet, and even if I peer and use remote gateway, those IP spaces as well. If I had multiple NVAs, well, today I have to put a load balancer in front of them. I wouldn't have to do that anymore. For each of the NVAs, they would both have a peering session to the route server. They'd both be advertising the same address space, but that's okay because they'd both have those routes. And so now the resources inside could use equal cost multipath, ECMP, and would just distribute the traffic out to them. If I want to do active passive, I could prepend, make the path longer for one of them to make it less likely to be used, but it could be if the other one wasn't available. So really, route server is all about those BGP learning the various routes available. The packets are not going via route server. It is not sort of a gateway appliance. It's just used to populate those IP spaces. And things like ExpressRoute and kind of the built-in VPN integrate with it to the extent that if I actually have ExpressRoute and VPN gateways, well, guess what? If I have route server, I can actually now do branch to branch via this. The same technology vWAN enables, that branch to branch via ExpressRoute to VPN gateways, will now work when I have route server as well. So route server, all about BGP and helping populate those address spaces. So that's what that's going to give me. More networking, ExpressRoute IPv6 support. So now I can have both IPv6 and IPv4 private address spaces in my VNets, and that will actually be supported across my ExpressRoute. There's also new ExpressRoute gateway metrics. Now these are in preview, but I can think about, well, count of routes learned, routes advertised, number of VMs in a VNet, frequency of routes changed. I can set up alerts based on those so I can kind of manage capacity. There are also supportability improvements. There's a nice experience now in the portal where for my kind of ExpressRoute from having problems, it will kind of guide me through various steps I can actually perform. Site-to-site VPN NAT preview. So if we think about ordinarily with VPN, the whole point of that VPN technology is, once again, I could think about, well, I have my VNet over here, and I'm using the site-to-site VPN to connect to something else. Now, maybe that's using 10.1.0, let's say 16. And this is maybe 10.5.0.0, which is fine. The IP spaces do not overlap. I'm all good. Because remember, a VPN is simply establishing a tunnel. It's from this IP space to this IP space, but those IP addresses are what I see on the other side, so they can't overlap. Well, now imagine I had to connect to another office. Well, that was using 10.1.0/16 as well. What do I do now? This doesn't work anymore. I can't have the same IP space. So what natting does is now as the traffic comes through, it will get natted. And there's going to be two types. So there's static. Static is kind of a one-to-one mapping. I need an equal address space over here to the size of this, because every kind of IP coming over will get an equivalent IP on a new IP space, letting me do bi-directional communication. There'll also be a dynamic. So dynamic will actually use a smaller IP space on this side, but it'll only be one-way direction. Obviously, I can get the responses back, but I won't be able to initiate from here going over to there, because they're going to now share a certain set of IP addresses. So this capability is kind of coming in a preview. I think vWAN has it today, and it's sort of coming to the rest of just regular site-to-site VPN. But that ability to now NAT the traffic lets me have overlapping IP spaces. And there were actually other VPN improvements. Again, I didn't go on to them here. I know, for example, there's a BGP dashboard now to see session status, advertisement, learnt routes. I can do a packet capture now via the portal for the VPN before I could do it from the command line. There's connection management, letting me reset individual connections. Point to site VPN, if I'm using open VPN protocol, well, now I can actually authenticate using AzureAD or CERT or Radius all on the same gateway. So my Windows clients can use AzureAD, my Linux clients can use certificates, but I don't have to now worry about, well, the gateway. I can have a single gateway and I can select which of those authentication options I actually want to enable on the same gateway. Azure Virtual WAN had some improvements. A big one was the VMware SD-WAN appliance can now run in the vWAN hub. I think that joins Cisco and Barracuda, now being able to actually run in that vWAN itself. And also now supports 100,000 remote point-to-site users. Obviously, in this world, as COVID and everyone's working from home, that ability to support more people kind of just connecting in is a big one. So now they're supporting 100,000 users. And also it does support these things. So the enhancements to point-to-site VPN, that open VPN with multiple protocols, it supports that. Azure Bastion has a number of improvements. So there's Key Vault integration now when I actually connect via Bastion. So what this really means is the user experience, if I actually just quickly show this, if I was actually going to go and connect to a virtual machine, so I'll go to my VMs, I'll go in this case to a Linux virtual machine, I'll say I want to connect, and I'll say use the Bastion. Well, now you'll notice I actually have the option to use the key from Azure Key Vault. So it's now integrating with Key Vault. Obviously, I would have to have permission to that Key Vault, but now I don't have to store it somewhere else. I can just say, hey, yeah, use this particular key from Key Vault. I would select the key and the vault, and now I'd be able to connect to it. Also, now I can use Bastion to actually go and connect to, for example, my AKS nodes. So if I was to jump back over to, for example, a scale set, and I just pick one of them, you can actually then look at my nodes, my instances, and pick one. You actually see there's that Bastion option for the support and troubleshooting. So I can actually go and use the Bastion to actually go and connect to my AKS nodes. So we have that as well. There's going to be health metrics for sessions, CPU, memory to help me see, hey, am I struggling with capacity? And also there's actually going to be this scalable Bastion. It will support up to 500 concurrent connections, and I'll actually be able to shrink down as well. So that's coming. Storage. So there's now going to be a ZRS option for both standard and premium SSD disks. Remember, ZRS is zone redundant. Today, managed disks are always locally redundant. There's 3 copies, but kind of in the same building, the same cluster. With this, now I'm going to have those 3 copies distributed over 3 availability zones, so I get better resiliency. But because of that, now because the data is actually over 3 of AZs, I'll actually now be able to have shareable disks and be attached to VMs in different availability zones. So it's better resiliency, and now my workloads that use shareable disks will also now get better resiliency as well. Today, the compute has to be in the same AZ as the disk, so they're all in the same AZ. Premium SSD performance tiers have gone GA. This is the ability to change the performance tier of my disk, but that disk has to be deallocated. It can't be on a running virtual machine, but I can say, hey, this smaller disk, I want to change your performance tier to a more expensive disk without changing its size. In preview, it's going to let me do that to a disk that's connected to a running compute resource. So that actual ability to change the performance tier without having to have it disconnected from a running resource. There's now premium SSD on-demand bursting for bigger SKUs. So today, we have a bursting capability for the smaller disks. If it's a P20, which I think is 512 gigabytes or smaller, it has a bucket that it can burst up to for free within that bucket of credit it's accrued. But I can't do it for the bigger disks. Well, now for the bigger disks, so above that P20, I can now actually do bursting whenever I want, but I'm going to pay for it. So now I can burst to higher amounts. I'm going to pay additional monies for that. And so you're going to kind of have this weighing up of, is it worth just doing this on-demand bursting, or if it's for a longer period of time, it'll probably make more sense to change the performance tier. But now we have these different options for bursting our performance as required. Either, hey, change the performance tier, or bigger disks, I can do on-demand bursting, or smaller disks, hey, we have that little bucket that we can leverage. Managed disk, customer managed key, auto key rotation. So if I have a disk encryption set, I have a customer managed key. The key is in my key vault. Today, if I change that key, I create a new version of the key, I have to then go and do actions on that disk encryption set to make it use the new version of the key. Well, in preview now, it will automatically see there's a new version within 1 hour and start using it. So I still have to go and create the new version of the key, but then I'm done. It will go and notice, hey, look, there's a new version. I'll go grab it and start using it, all within 1 hour. Blob backup is now in preview. So this is very similar to Azure Files. It's not that it's taking the blob backup and copying it to a recovery services vault. This is where Azure Backup becomes that management engine to configure the native features of blob, like change tracking, point-in-time versions, snapshots. All of those features are now managed via Azure Backup to centrally kind of control that thing, but it's not moving the data to a recovery services vault. It's just giving me that central place where I can configure it, and then it will use the in-place capabilities of the storage account. Onto database. So Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance will now have maintenance windows. Today, maintenance is run between 5 p.m. and 8 a.m. local time. It's fully available during that time. There's just potentially a short failover within the SLA. Well, you're now going to have these maintenance windows you can pick, kind of weekday, I think it's 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Monday to Thursday, or weekend 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Friday to Sunday. There's also now advanced SQL notification. It's going to tie into the service health capability of Azure. And then through service health, I can call Azure Monitor action groups to email me, message me, call an Azure function, a logic app, a webhook. So I'll get kind of 24 hours notice through those service health, and I can pick how it communicates. Then at the start of the maintenance and the end of the maintenance, it will trigger as well to really just keep me informed. Azure SQL Database and Synapse will now support sending their audits, logs to Log Analytics and/or Event Hub. Basically now means I can have that single location to store and send that data to. So that's GA. CosmosDB in preview, so the Mongo v4 API is now supported. So obviously Mongo v4 did a whole bunch of things like multi-document transactions, new aggregations like to Boolean, to date, just better overall ecosystem support by now having that Mongo v4 API supported. There's also now this continuous backup and point-in-time restore. So that's going to be an option now when I actually go and create a new CosmosDB account. So if I jump over, one of the things now, if I'm creating a brand new, let's go to this one, CosmosDB, I have the option of, well, what is the backup I actually want? So we go to backup policy, and now we have, hey, I can have this periodic, or I can do continuous. So with continuous, as kind of the name suggests, to any second I want within the last 30 days, I can recover to. So that's if the account is deleted, the container is deleted, I have some kind of accidental corruption, I'll be able to go to any second in the last 30 days and restore. Also for CosmosDB, role-based access control. So now what I'm going to be able to do is define a kind of set of roles for CosmosDB and create a role in AzureAD. Now there were none built in. I'll have to actually go and create this. Today there's a special kind of preview version of the PowerShell module or the CLI to be able to create these roles that operate on the data plane. Then I'll be able to create a role and grant it to users groups, no more having to use that kind of master access key. There's now managed instance for the Apache Cassandra. So if we think about it, often we try and move from Cassandra to CosmosDB. We have the Cassandra APIs, but maybe I can't do that. Maybe I just need to move kind of as is. So this is built by the same people that do CosmosDB, but now I can actually run this in my virtual network, but it's a PaaS offering. It's managed by Azure. But now I can actually have a Apache Cassandra cluster running in my environment, but a lot of the kind of the maintenance work is done for me. So I can very easily now lift and shift my Cassandra into Azure. AzureAD. So passwordless authentication has gone GA. So if I think FIDO2 keys, if I think Hello for Business, if I think the Authenticator app, there's different scenarios for those, they're GA. Temporary access pass, again, I just did a video on that, so check it out. But the idea of that is it's a short-lived code that the admin can generate and give to the user directly, and they can authenticate with that as a strong authentication. That can then bootstrap, i.e. enable them to turn on a passwordless authentication like FIDO2 or Hello for Business without having to actually have a regular password first. And again, I go into that in detail. AzureAD conditional access authentication contexts are coming into preview. So think about it, conditional access ordinarily has a set of controls around an app, for example. But maybe that app has different levels of data. Maybe SharePoint has really important data and less important data. So these authentication contexts, I'm basically going to firstly create a label. I'll create an authentication context in conditional access, really just a name. Then I'll create a conditional access policy that for that tag sets the conditions that I have to meet to basically populate that tag. And then for supporting workloads, I can say, hey, I need that particular authentication context, that label, to be able to see this. Maybe for PIM, instead of requiring MFA, I need this authentication context. To access this Microsoft information protected data in SharePoint that has this confidential label, I need you to have this authentication context, i.e. you met these particular conditions via conditional access. So it's just a more granular set of capabilities. AWS SSO is now just built in. If I go and look at kind of those enterprise apps, I'll see AWS gives me very easy now ability to use my Azure AD credentials against my AWS subscriptions accounts, etc. Azure AD verifiable credentials has gone preview. So this is really the whole decentralized identity thing. The idea of building on blockchain technologies to let me really be in control of my data. So I can use things like the Authenticator app or another wallet app to carry around basically statements about me. Maybe it's a certain credential, hey, you've passed this test. That I can then give permission to other entities to be able to see, and it can be authenticated back to that issuing kind of party. So this whole Azure AD verifiable credentials is now in preview. You can go and start trying this out. I'll do a deeper dive video on that over the next couple of weeks. Azure AD external identities has gone GA. This is really a new way to manage thinking about some of those B2B relationships and that kind of onboarding experience. There's also a new billing model behind that if I leverage it. It adds things like Facebook identities for that. So really just a whole new way of thinking about interacting with my kind of partners and my customers. And then Azure AD App Proxy now has a header-based authentication, has now gone GA for those various types of workloads. Also now there's got geo-routing in terms of, hey, I want to go to this particular app proxy service that's closer to my underlying resource to improve performance, reduce latency. There were some other things around kind of, there's an ADFS activity report was announced, giving me now insight into, well, these are the apps you're using for ADFS. Actually, you could move these to Azure AD direct integration. There's also more partnerships for legacy, like non-HTTP, LDAP, SSH apps to integrate with Azure AD. So a lot of partnerships were kind of announced as well. Azure Arc. So the Arc-enabled Kubernetes has gone GA. Remember, Arc is about bringing that Azure management and capabilities outside of Azure. Could be on premises, could be in other clouds. So with the Arc, it's any CNCF compliant Kubernetes distribution. So OpenShift, AKS, others. I can then use things like the Azure policy for containers, monitoring for containers, security center, inventory, tagging. All of those things I can then leverage on those Kubernetes environments. And then through that, I can use GitOps, the ability to say, hey, I want you to go and look at this Git repo. And as I then checking kind of YAML files, for example, it will look at those and deploy them. It will go and fetch whatever images it needs from container registries to populate that onto the Kubernetes environment using Flux v1 to track and get that. If I looked in the Kubernetes portal, I can see my AKS and my kind of Arc all together. So a great way to kind of have that single pane of glass and unified management for Kubernetes. If I have that Kubernetes manage that Arc service running, I can now deploy on top of that, the same way I could do data services, Arc-enabled machine learning. So now, with this kind of a one click, I can deploy machine learning to my environments that are managed by Arc to now get Azure machine learning tools for training purposes. But the data can be where it is. I don't have to bring it into Azure to use the Azure machine learning. The data could be on-prem. Well, I've got my sort of Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster on-prem. I can now deploy the machine learning and use the familiar tools. Azure Machine Learning Studio, Azure Machine Learning Python SDK, open source tools like TensorFlow, whatever it may be, I can now just run on top of that, running wherever I have it, close to my data, so the data doesn't have to move. And then other stuff. There's a lot of other stuff. So the private Azure Marketplace has gone GA. So the point of the private marketplace is I can enable this thing. I have to actually create a marketplace admin. And then once I have this, I'll just show it quick. I can then start populating it. So if I actually go over here, if I just was to go home and create a resource and just do see all, you can see I actually have this idea at the top of a private marketplace. Now I have to be a global admin to grant someone the marketplace admin role, which I have. So once you have that marketplace role, well, I have to get started. So I would add items. These are sort of third-party things I want to show up in this marketplace. Once I've populated it with the offers I want to be available, notice Microsoft offers are approved by default, I enable the marketplace. Once I enable it, then only the things that I have approved will be available to people in their subscriptions. This is tenant-wide. So this is going to kind of have a big scope. So you want to be a little bit careful with this. You don't start blocking a whole bunch of stuff. But it's going to let me be in control of what I want running in my environment by using that kind of private marketplace. Automatic VM guest patching for Linux is in preview. So this is going to do those security or critical patches. They're going to be automatically downloaded and applied during off-peak hours. There's a whole patch kind of orchestration solution. The VM is assessed periodically. It's already in preview for Windows, but now I can do it for Linux as well. And that kind of then builds into this Azure Auto Manage service that is in preview. And I'll actually just jump over once again pretty quick, because what this is actually going to give me is, if we just go and look at this thing, I'll go to this one. If we do Auto Manage, what I do is I kind of onboard virtual machines. So I'll say, hey, what machines do I want to onboard? And I can pick all of the ones that are eligible. So I could just pick a couple of virtual machines. Notice, kind of these are all kind of Windows machines right here, but it kind of would support Linux as well. So I could select those. And then I pick an environment. Is this dev test or is this production? Because it is going to decide what it should do. It's going to follow a whole bunch of Azure best practice documents. And I can see, well, what is it going to do? So if we compare environments, so production, it does things like backup. If it's dev test, maybe I don't want to pay for that, so it doesn't do backup. But notice it does things like anti-malware, it doesn't do that for Linux. So I don't get that for Linux VMs, but for Windows I do. But it's going to do things like update management, change tracking, guest configurations. For Linux, it's audit only. A whole bunch of different things compared to the production where I get other types of work going on. I can tweak certain things. So I can create my own preferences. So I could pick my own requirements around backup and anti-malware. For example, maybe I run my own anti-malware solution. I don't want the Azure solution put on that. So I could say, hey, don't do that. But the whole point of this is it's really taking the OS as a service. We think of IaaS and PaaS. This now sits in the middle to really do all of the day-to-day things I don't really want to do. It becomes an exception-only management model. I'll only get told when it can't work out what to do. And it actually includes this idea of hot patching. So there's a special Azure edition version of Server 29. If I use this special edition that works with automanage, it does hot patching. So hot patching is where it can actually hot patch areas of memory that under normal circumstances there'd be reboots involved. So when I use this hot patching capability, now it's going to do these hot patches periodically, and maybe only now every 3 months it will do a cumulative update that requires things to actually reboot. There might be out-of-band things as well, but it's going to be a lot less interruption to my actual workload. So we're going to have this special 2019 Data Center Azure Edition is available, again, behind that auto manage. Azure Backup kind of had a bunch of improvements. So the Backup Center, that's that single place to go to really discover things and control policy, and that's GA. Reports is now GA as well. So it sits on top of Log Analytics Workspace. I send data to the workspace, and then I light up a whole bunch of different things through workbooks to actually get that information into my backup. Archive tier is now in preview. So if you think about the Recovery Services Vault, now I can actually go to an archive tier, which remember is super, super cheap. So for virtual machines, we have those kind of daily, weekly, monthly, annual point in times we want to keep. The monthly and annuals we can now actually send to archive. If it's for SQL running in VMs, if it's older than 45, I can send that to archive. So basically going to save money. And alerts are now in preview. So what this means is it's actually going to hook into the Azure Monitor Alert Groups functionality. Again, email, SMS, webhook, function, logic app. And so if I had a backup data deleted or a backup failed or restore failed, it could hook into those various types of alerting to let me know. And then there are a whole bunch of various Azure Migrate features. We talked before about improvements to the VMware solution as a target for Azure Backup. The Azure Migrate PowerShell module to manage a lot of these things in bulk. There's now a unified discovery and assessment for SQL servers just actually built in to Azure Migrate. Azure Monitor App Insights for Node.js apps running on a Linux app service. I can now do a no-code light up for App Insights. So now just get that information about it. Azure Monitor for Windows Virtual Desktops. I can see a summary of host pull status and health. I can troubleshoot problems. I can see resource utilizations all through Azure Monitor for Windows Virtual Desktop. Azure Monitor for Containers has a number of updates. I can see things like capacity for volumes, for persistent volumes, And also, if I actually jump over, it's probably easier to see it. So if I actually jump over and look at a Kubernetes service, and I'll just look at my CNI. If I go to my actual insights, what you can actually now see through here is if I go to reports, we then light up a bunch of really new things. So I can see information on those persistent volume details, for example. So there's actually now reports on that directly. I can see things around kind of disk capacity. I can see things about the network. I can see things about workload details. Just a whole bunch of information that I can actually now go and get very, very easily. Windows Server 2022 has gone into preview, not Azure, but given some of the correlations they're doing with workloads and security, I just wanted to mention it is there. A lot of improvements around like it as an app platform, image size, containers, but also really big. I think it was 48 terabytes of memory supported, 2048 logical cores. So there's obviously some goodness there. Go and check that out. Azure Security Center had a number of improvements. So it now very tightly integrates with Microsoft Defender for that endpoint EDR. So what that means now is I'm going to get this better integration when there are issues through kind of the Microsoft Defender endpoint solutions for Server 29 and WVD directly into Azure Security Center. I'm going to see those things, be able to go and actually link around. And also the alert experience is now in line with Sentinel. So if you ever looked at the new alerting experience, it's again, in line with what Sentinel does. If we go and look at it, I have the nice little blue pills to go and filter on the various types of things. If I just select that quickly and go to my alerts, it's this very rich experience. Again, we have kind of the blue pills we can click on and they pop out to really see. I can easily add various types of filters. I can group by different things, just a very clear interface with exactly what is happening in my environment. Then Azure Sentinel. So they got a bunch of new connectors. Actually, I'll just jump back over to this again. And this is all about, remember, Azure Sentinel's power comes from, well, I have to get the data into it before I can do intelligent stuff with it. So they basically added a whole bunch of new connectors. So if I go to my Azure Sentinel and we go over and look at data connectors, well, there are now things, for example, around, if I do, there's VMware, you can see there's Salesforce, there's also a whole bunch of different Azure ones. So I can see things like information protection, AKS, Key Vault, and there's storage is available as well somewhere over there. But basically just a whole bunch of new connectors to really get things into Sentinel. So then I can kind of do good stuff with that. There's also new automation rules. So these are going to enable me to have a common set of actions and playbooks I might want to call. Remember, GitHub has a huge collection of playbooks I can easily deploy, which are essentially logic apps. And I can even run those automation rules in sequence. There's data ingestion improvements. So there's now this shared incidents schema between Microsoft 365 Defender and Azure Sentinel. So again, now the related alerts, the entities from Microsoft 365 Defender will show up in Sentinel. I'll have kind of these deep link options to be able to click one of those things and jump over to the Microsoft 365 Defender. Notebooks have gone GA as well. So that was actually it. I tried to cover it as quick as I could. I didn't want this to be too long, but obviously there was a huge amount of content there. Check out the book and news. Check out the Microsoft Ignite actual channel on YouTube. You can go and look at a lot of the sessions. But I hope this was useful. I hope it gives you some idea of at least things maybe you want to go and dive into more detail. And until next time, take care.